Friends, colleagues, students, visitors, welcome to the Melbourne School of Design Dean's Lecture Series. My name is Julie Willis and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning here at the University of Melbourne. I begin today's proceedings by acknowledging the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander traditional custodians of the unceded land on which we work and learn. We pay respects to the elders past and present, and of course the place of Indigenous knowledge in the Academy. And I acknowledge any Indigenous peoples who join us here today. Today's lecture marks the final instalment of the Dean's Lecture Series for 2021. It's a little hard to believe how quickly time has flown this year. The Dean's Lecture Series aims to connect the Melbourne community with international leaders in built environment fields, and it's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to bring our design community of students, academics, professionals and interested members of the public together for events such as these. Particularly for those in lockdown areas, coming together as a community is more important than ever, and I'm happy to see you all here today. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Nicholas Blomley as our guest speaker. Nicholas is a Professor of Geography at Simon Fraser University in Canada. He's been influential in creating the field of legal geography, which ultimately explores the relationship between the law and space. Within legal geography, he has a particular focus on property and has extensively explored this area in relation to homelessness, poverty, and the regulation of public property. His work looks at the spatiality of legal practices and relationships and the world-making consequences of such legal geographies. Much of his empirical work concerns the often oppressive effects of legal relations on marginalised and oppressed peoples, and reveals how property is implicated in geographies of power, subordination and resistance. He's worked on many different and cross-disciplinary projects over the years, including the analysis of rental precarity in Greater Vancouver, the study of court-imposed red zones imposed on street-involved people and protesters in Montreal and Vancouver, researching the dispossession of Japanese Canadians in the 1940s, and the governance of poor people's possessions by private and public regulators in Canadian cities. As Nicholas himself says, people care about land, and thinking about land and people's relationship to land is of fundamental importance. While it's not a legal obligation for a planner, an architect or a practitioner analysing property to engage with communities, it is intrinsically a moral one. I'm sure all of us, especially in the built environment sphere, can agree with this. It is of the utmost importance to consider how one's work will have impact on the most marginalised residents in society. Please join me now in welcoming Nicholas Blomley.
Thank you very, very much. I should begin by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the ancestral, traditional and unceded lands of the Katzie and Kwantlen First Nation in what is now suburban Vancouver. I wish I could be with you in Melbourne in person, but I'm honoured to be with you virtually, and thank you, Dean Willis, for the invitation to present in the Dean's Lecture Series. I'm looking forward to my virtual visit. I'm going to be on campus, as it were, virtually for the next week or so. So look forward to seeing you in electronic corridors and rooms and sharing digital cups of tea. I'm going to share my screen if I can. My paper, as you can see, is called Making Property Outlaws, Law and Relegation. At the bottom of the screen, I've got a couple of articles from which I'm broadly drawing this presentation today. The second one is more closely related to this topic, and it's just come out. It's available online in early view in IJER, the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. And as you can see, my paper is co-authored with The Right to Remain Collective. And I wanted to start by talking about The Right to Remain Collective. The Right to Remain is an ongoing community-based research project. It's been going for several years. It's led by Jeff Masuda at the University of Victoria in BC. And it's situated and grounded in a neighbourhood called the Downtown East Side in Vancouver. This is a neighbourhood that is poor in wealth, but rich in history, activism, and potential. Our project is run collaboratively. It involves academic researchers, non-profit societies, grassroots community organisers, and students. And we work with peer researchers, community members who are engaged directly in doing a lot of the work. So on the top right of the screen, you can see Jack Gates. He was at the City Archive looking at doing work on the history of his neighbourhood, in particular, the place in which he lives. And we'll see Jack in a few slides. Peer researchers have uncovered vital data about the history of the downtown East Side. One crucial aspect of this relates to the history of the struggle to recognize the legal rights of people who live in the residential hotels of the area, or the SRO, or Single Room Occupancy hotels. SRO hotels typically comprise small single rooms, about 10 by 10 feet, with a shared bathroom on each floor, with a shared kitchen. They were built, many of them, at the turn of the 20th century for seasonal workers in the resource industry. Over time, they've become the last stop before homelessness. There are some 87 privately owned SROs open in Vancouver today. Their rents have gone increasingly up. They are aging, often decrepit places with very poor maintenance, many of them, and numerous health and safety code violations. They're often owned by very extractive, predatory landlords. Now, the right to remain works very symbiotically with this grassroots organization. It's called the SRO Collaborative, and the SRO Collaborative organizes SRO tenants. As this image suggests, crucial to SRO life is the relationship that tenants have to their landlords. To understand this, I want us to step back a little bit and just spend a little time thinking about the manner in which property relations constitute life in SROs. And that's the focus for my presentation today. I encourage us to think about property in relational terms, most immediately, to recognize that property is not a relation between a person and a thing, but fundamentally a set of relations or rules between people in regards to a valued resource. Property rules determine who can and who cannot use and access certain vital resources, notably land. The power I have in regard to things may give me power over other people. If I am the owner of a valuable and scarce resource like urban land, I am legally empowered, more or less, to decide how that land will be used. I might choose to exclude others from that land entirely, or allow others to access my land, but under conditions I get to choose, for example, by renting it out to tenants. Property is relational in a second sense. There is no outside to property, I want to suggest. We are all entangled inside it all the time, but in distinct and different ways, in complicated patterns of interlocking dependency, privilege, and vulnerability. Everyone's use or benefit of land for shelter depends on a legal relationship with others. We access land through and in relation to others. Many of those others are placed in positions of legal power relative to us. This can be through the permission or contractual agreement of others, like a lease on an apartment. It might occur through conditional forms of access, for example, a houseless person camped on city land. It can also occur through the forced compliance of others. All settlers access land through a relationship, of course, with indigenous societies, the original holders of the land, although on highly unequal terms. For many people, access and use of property depends on privileged others who grant access under very asymmetrical and hierarchical terms. And one way in which I've tried to think about this is to frame them through a precarious property lens. I use the word precarious advisedly. The word itself was first used in English in a legal context to refer to a legal arrangement where person A accesses property through the conditional permission of person B, who can revoke that permission at any time. So a precarious property relation entails a power-liability pairing in which one party has the power to change a particular set of relations, while the other lacks relative immunity to such changes. We can think of lots of examples of precarious property. Landlord-tenant relations in SROs, I'm going to suggest, are highly precarious in that sense. The relationship between indigenous people and the state also can be thought of through this lens, or the relation between homeless people and the state. The crisis in 2008 also revealed that mortgagee-mortgagor relations can also be precarious. Globally, precarious property relations have grown in scope and significance. Most of us globally are precarious. In my work, I've tried to theorize this relationship through a property lens, to try to think through the work of law in producing precarious property relations, and also uncover lived examples of the way in which precarious property is actually produced. And this brings us back to the SRO and the relationship between landlord and tenant. You'll remember Jack Gates from that earlier slide, a tenant researcher. Jack was a member of the Right to Remain and the SRO Collaborative. Jack is an Indigenous man, a member of the Haida Nation. He also lived in an SRO. In the middle of the night, someone tried to break down his door with a shovel. Jack was renting a room in a place called the Regent Hotel, an SRO in the heart of Vancouver's downtown east side. The hotel was owned by a family called the Sahotas, an infamous slumlord family. The Regent was in terrible condition, without heat and hot water. Activists like Jack had worked hard to mobilize law against the rampant illegalities of his landlord without much success. The Regent, in fact, was one of the city's top violators of Landlord Tenant Law. Now, Jack had elected to stay at the Regent. He felt an obligation to support fellow tenants from the predations of his landlord. His activism ensured that he became the target of continuous and ongoing violence. The Sahotas routinely hired other tenants as muscle, one of whom had tried to break down or had broken down Jack's door with a shovel. The police response to this brazen attack was striking. It wasn't to buttress Jack's rights to safety as a tenant, but rather the blunt advice that he should simply move out. Insofar as the authorities were concerned, he was in a space in which he should expect violence and was not to expect state protection. Regardless, Jack stayed, continuing to live in fear of his life, but continuing to organize the tenants until ultimately the Regent was finally condemned and the residents relocated. Now, Jack's situation is not unusual. It was in part an outcome of the place he lived and the way in which that place has been historically represented. The downtown east side in general, and private SROs in particular, like many spaces in cities, has long been treated as ungovernable and lawless. Jack lives in what we might call an outlaw zone in that sense, a space that seems to be outside the law. The Regent Hotel occupies the infamous 100 block of West Hastings Street, which was characterized by one observer as, quote, the worst block in Vancouver, unquote, transformed by, quote, escalating anarchy, unquote, into a space beyond the pale of civilization. Now, Western liberal legality relies on a sharp divide between that which is law and that which is positioned as outside law. However, Southern urbanists ask us to question this divide in their treatment of informality. They argue that that which appears to be outside the state may in fact be constituted by the state in some interesting ways. And here I'm going to suggest it might be useful to think about the concept of the outlaw. So bear with me, if you will, for a little while. I want us to think about outlaws, but I want us to think about outlaws in two senses. The word outlaw has two meanings. In its first sense, as we've already seen, it denotes lawlessness, the antithesis of law. The transitive verb signifies the designation of something as illegal, like the outlawing of dueling. As a noun, an outlaw refers to a lawless or rebellious person, someone who refuses legal constraints to advance their own anomic ends, like Ned Kelly. I thought I should bring some Australian content in. As landlords, the Sahotas are outlaws in that sense, in their refusal to abide by landlord tenant law or the constraints of fire codes. Jack Gates lives in an outlaw zone in that sense. But there's a second, very different or subtly different meaning to outlaw. As a noun, it refers to a person who has been formally excluded from the benefit or protection of law. As a transitive verb, to the designation of outlaw status in which a person is deprived of such benefits. It's the movement between these two meanings that I think is productive in thinking about Jack's experience, the Outlaw Zone and the Regent Hotel and other SROs in the downtown east side. And more generally, I think, in thinking about urban space. Outlaw in this second sense, then, is not a condition outside or in opposition to law, but a legally produced status in which a person, designated an outlaw, is stripped of the protection and rights of law. The outlaw loses the right to have rights. Outlawry, as it's called, has very ancient precedents. You can find it in Greek and Roman law. It was taken up in Germanic and Scandinavian legal systems. You can find it in the English common law. In Icelandic law, for example, someone declared an outlaw as an outcome of a suit, lost the rights accorded to members of the community, like the right to own property. They were exiled for life, stripped of legal personality, and thus treated as though dead. Outlaw status, therefore, is a product of law. It entails a performative proclamation. Caput gerat lupinum, may he bear the wolf's head, in the English common law variant, and vagus esto, become a wolf, in the Frankish person. Deprived of legal protection, the outlaw, like the wolf, should be killed, and can be killed with impunity. Outlawry, in a sense, entails a form then of legal relegation, in which a person is placed in a condition of heightened vulnerability, providing legal immunity to others who are empowered to subjugate the outlaw. This isn't a state of abandonment or exile, in other words, for the writ of the law is clearly operative. Outlaw status, to reiterate, is legally produced and legally regulated. And as I understand it, Ned Kelly was an outlaw in this second sense. He was declared an outlaw. Ineligible for personhood, outlawry is also tied often to racialized forms of devaluation. It was commonplace, for example, in American slavery law. Fugitive slaves were outlawed, making it lawful for others to kill or harm them. Outlawry is also spatialized. The spaces to which the outlaw flees are imagined as transgressive, liminal, and threatening. Let's come back then to the SRO. And what I want to give in the space I have left to me is to give you a very quick history of the way in which people living in SROs, despite being leaders in changing the status of tenants in law, became outlawed in this second sense, relegating them to spaces of radical precarity. Now, tenants, generally speaking, live under more or less precarious property relations, yet they do have a few rights, of course, relative to landlords. For example, in British Columbia, they can only be evicted under certain conditions, non-payment of rent, for example, and only with appropriate notice. This is a very recent innovation. Until 1970, Landlord Tenant Law, which is a provincial responsibility in Canada, was largely unchanged since the 19th century. Landlords could raise rents at will, they could evict tenants without cause. They also had the power to distrain, that is, to seize a tenant's property if they didn't pay their rent. Now, tenants began organizing in Vancouver in the late 1960s. This is an image from 1969 that speaks in part to this tenant organizing. A group called the Vancouver Tenants Council lobbied to change the law. They asked for just cause for eviction, for example. And in 1970, interestingly, the province enacted a revised Landlord Tenant Act, a modern landlord tenant law. It limited rent increases to 1 per year. It abolished the right of distraint on the part of the landlord. It limited security deposits, placed the responsibility on landlords for repairs, and permitted tenants to challenge evictions if their legal rights were being violated. What we didn't know until we began engaging in this research is that a lot of the organizing around this was actually happening in the place then called Skid Road, later to become called the downtown east side, the very poorest neighborhood in the city. People living in the hotels and lodging houses of this area, of course, were particularly vulnerable. This is a wonderful image. It's from the archive. One of the tenant researchers found it, and it's a handmade tenant organizing notice that invites all downtown apartment, hotel, and rooming house residents to come together to get down to discuss the rights of tenants. So we see then organizing happening actually in these on Skid Road. This is a photograph from this period. It shows a man on the right there with the fedora. That's Lewis Williams, who was apparently the president of the Downtown Tenants Association, which is trying to advocate on behalf of people living in these living on Skid Road in these hotels. And what's striking, moreover, is that tenant organizing in the neighborhood made a difference in the neighborhood. In June 1970, the first case under the new law came before the court, in a case in which a landlord sought to evict a tenant of a building called the Orwell Apartments because he refused to pay an improper rent increase. The tenant, interestingly, was Lewis Williams, the man with the fedora, and the Orwell was a rooming house built in 1911. Strikingly also, the court found for Williams. Fast forward to 1972. A leftist party, the New Democratic Party, took power provincially, partly, ironically, on a pro-tenant platform. They beefed up and revised the Landlord Tenant Act, and crucially, the new act explicitly made a distinction between licensees and tenants, eliminating protection under the Act for people who were designated as licensees. Now, this is a bit geeky, but it's a bit of a legal technicality, but a very important one. The distinction between license and tenancy rests on how people use and control their rented unit. A tenant, rather than a licensee, is assumed to have what's called exclusive possession, a degree of control over their space relative to the landlord. Someone who's renting a hotel room by the day, of course, doesn't have a tenancy. They have a license, a conditional permission granted by the owner to exercise a certain privilege, like sleeping, that would otherwise constitute an illegal act, a trespass. Now, community organizers in the Skid Road, now reconstituted the downtown east side, assumed, as had been prior practice, that SRO residents, who of course were living in their units for extended periods of time, were governed or captured by landlord tenant law. They were tenants insofar as organizers were concerned, and indeed that seemed to be the message that the prior practice had revealed. Indeed, they sought to use this new law to protect the many people living in the SROs of the neighborhood, particularly as rents rose, lobbying somebody called the rentalsman, who was a person charged with policing this new law. Now, initially, in November 1974, the rentalsman, who was a man called Barry Clark, announced confidently that what he called Skid Road hotels came under the protection of the Landlord Tenant Act. But in May 75, he received a report from his lawyers, he said, which, quote, indicated that the hotels under their licenses are exempt from the Act. This became known in the media as the Skid Road Exemption or the lodger's loophole. Residents, as a consequence of SROs, were expelled from the modest protections of landlord-tenant law. However, they weren't outside property. We are always inside property to some degree. Technically speaking, they were in fact covered by something called the Innkeepers Act, or the Hotel Innkeepers Act, a venerable piece of legislation. The Innkeepers Act, like its name suggests, gives innkeepers powers to act relative to licensees. Guests are only allowed between certain hours and are charged extra if guests stay overnight. Guests are continually policed or excluded, including organizers, community organizers. Rents could be raised at any time. Distraint was operative. Residents' good could be seized to cover unpaid rent, and most particularly, innkeepers had the legal power to evict residents without notice or for any cause. No cause, no notice was needed, no mediation mechanism, no appeal. As one community organizer report put it at the time, when a lodging house resident contests his or her eviction, the police are called in and they stand by while the resident and belongings are moved onto the street. The Vancouver Police's position of non-intervention always leads to the resident being evicted. The police are in fact correct in that they are there to quell violence and uphold the letter of the law. SRO residents, in other words, had been outlawed. They had lost the right to have rights, including the meagre property rights that they had relative to their homes and their possessions. Bearing the wolf's head, others were now entitled to do violence to them. It's interesting to ask why the exemption, and the paper tries to grapple with this. It's not entirely obvious, but I think there are some threads that we can pull out. The first is an obvious one. Poor people in a poor neighbourhood don't matter. Residents on Skid Road and their rights relative to property had long been devalued. Hotels in particular became identified increasingly as sites of disease and criminality, with relatively little attention given to the landlords. The problems of the neighbourhood were seen largely in terms of the presumed deficiencies and pathologies of the residents, not those who derived wealth from it or those who regulated it. But there's a second dimension. This is a wonderful piece from the archive that one could read in many ways. The text itself, the typed text itself, is a report from the rentalsman from 1976 on the legal status of people living in hotels. And what you have all around the margins here are responses from community organisers, in particular a group called the Downtown Eastside Residents Association, who are, as you can see, talking back to the rentalsman. But it's the rentalsman ultimately whose voice is loudest. He says a couple of things, one of which is striking. You can see that at the top of the text there. He says, the most significant conclusion of our investigation is that most of the tenants in these facilities do not wish or require the services of this office. They don't need landlord tenant protection. Anyone who disturbs the peace and quiet is immediately evicted. And this apparently is what the fellow occupants desire. Rent collection appears to be no problem, as the innkeeper has the right to seize chattels, to seize a tenant's property. Most important, I suspect we would seriously, he says, disrupt the entire relationship between landlords and tenants in this section of the city. In short, it is my recommendation to leave well alone. It's hard to interpret this argument as anything but a very blunt endorsement of the power of the owner and a profound devaluation of the relationship that SRO residents have to their home. In other documents, it's quite clear that residents are constituted or imagined as too vulnerable to be protected. If landlords were forced to raise standards because of the Landlord Tenant Law, quote, they will not be able to tolerate renting their rooms to a number of current clients who are alcoholics, collectors of junk, etc. These people who are hard to house will be without shelter, he says. Many of these people could be evicted easily under the Landlord and Tenant Act due to their behaviour, and the landlord could then raise rents for the next person. Those who are difficult to house would find themselves expelled from all hotels, which have been more tolerant of them than any rooming house. The very outlaw status of SROs and SRO tenants, or residents, justifies apparently their continued exclusion from Landlord Tenant Law. They are too vulnerable to be protected. The core of the exemption then is a calculated differentiation. The poor are not like us, it seems. Outlaw people are too vulnerable to be protected. Outlaws, by extension, deserve outlaw housing. and outlaw landlords. The affirmative benefits that property rights provide SRO tenants, meagre though they are summarily dismissed. In that sense, the outlaw are denied the right to have rights. They are ineligible for personhood, while subject to law, they are not to be its beneficiaries. Now, one thread that I don't have time to unpack, but I'm going to come back to at the end, is community organizing. Because community organizers, notably the Downtown Eastside Residents Association, contests time and again this process of outlawry. This is a community newspaper produced by DERA in which this is documented. They note the way in which this has empowered hotel owners to evict arbitrarily, to confiscate possessions at will, and to raise rents exorbitantly. This becomes a particularly important issue in the mid-1980s, when the decision was made that the city of Vancouver would host the so-called Expo World's Fair. Many hotel owners in the Downtown Eastside began summarily evicting residents, assuming that they could then attract tourists to come to their hotels. DERA became concerned and lobbied the city and the province to bring in emergency protection for hotel residents. The province declined. It was a neoliberal party in power, and as you can see, the argument was a very neoliberal one, that basically this was expensive land and people should simply be put on buses to the Kootenays. This is in the interior of the province, many hundreds of kilometers away. The world runs by greed, according to one advisor. Everyone is greedy in one way or another. What we're talking about is relative greed. It's not a question of dire necessity. It's a question of choice of location. They were simply in the wrong place. In the months leading up to Expo, nearly 1,000 residents were evicted, often with a day's notice. This had profound effects for many people. Several people lost their lives or took their lives as a consequence of this tsunami of evictions. In 1989, finally, the province begrudgingly brought residents of SROs under the protection of the Residential Tenancy Act. But so ingrained was the prevailing regime that precarious property relations endure. There is the Skid Road exemption, in other words, has a half-life. It continues to shape landlord-tenant relations, arguably in the SROs of the Downtown East Side, in at least two ways. Firstly, as we saw with Jack Gates, many landlords in private hotels act as if they are still governed by the Innkeepers Act. And on the left of the screen here, you can see some quotes from interviews that peer researchers did with other tenants, describing the highly precarious property relations that they continued to endure. As one put it in a hotel, the landlord tried to force his way into my room. He said that it is his hotel and he can come into my room anytime he wants. Another noted that we are just an income to them. The quality of living, the quality of the maintenance of the building was an irrelevance. A third noted that nobody wants to make complaints, because if you do complain, you're going to become a headache. And as a headache, the landlord is going to get rid of you, going to evict you summarily. There's also a group of hotels that have been designated, quote, supportive housing. These, as their name suggests, in theory, provide some level of supports for residents struggling with various challenges, mental health and otherwise. Residents of SROs deemed supportive housing are supposed to be protected by Landlord Tenant Law. They are tenants, legally speaking. However, strikingly, many tenants are forced to sign what are called program agreements. This is a template I just pulled off the internet, in which they sign away their rights in order to access the supposed benefits of supportive services. So you can see at the bottom, the right to occupy B Part 2, the Residential Tenancy Act, does not apply to this agreement. The program accommodation is exempt from the Residential Tenancy Act, as the program accommodation is only made available in the course of providing the program participant with the support services. They become, in effect, licensees. I'm about to conclude, but I have a couple of slides, and then I want to share some other material with you. But I wanted to bring things to the present. Outlawry, as we've seen, is still very much an issue, and the struggle around outlaw status continues in important ways. But as I noted, it was and continues to be contested by the community. Community organizing played a crucial role in creating tenancy protections initially for hotel residents. Community organizers contested their subsequent outlawry, as we have seen. And community organizing, including the SRO Collaborative, has been instrumental in pushing for new legal protections for tenants. This is an image, a mocked up image that somebody produced. The Downtown Eastside SRO Collaborative does not have an office, as you can see here, that is shared by a sex shop, although it's hoping to, in fact, develop as a hub. But crucial to its organizing, as well as the work of the Right to Remain, concerns a proposal that is before Vancouver City Council and will be decided on in, I think, 3 weeks. And that concerns the question as to whether the city will support or advocate for something called vacancy control in SROs. What's vacancy control? Well, as it stands, there is no such thing as vacancy control. Landlords are incentivized by the prevailing system to evict tenants, as they can then raise rents. Rents follow the tenant. Vacancy control, however, ties rents to the unit. So the SROC and the Right to Remain are fighting for vacancy control specifically in SROs. Rather than a form of relegation, this would entail a form of promotion, giving SRO tenants added rights by virtue of their current precarity. In a sense, this is outlawry flipped on its head. It isn't an argument that SRO residents are too vulnerable to be protected, but rather that their vulnerability is such that they require additional protection. They are in the outlaw zone because they have been relegated to outlaw status, in other words. The state has produced their precarity, it is argued. So it must, in a sense, remove the wolf's head and grant them full personhood. So why is this of utility, or I hope of interest? I think there are a couple of things we could say, and I can add more. But firstly and most immediately, I think it's vital to tell the story of building forms like SROs. We know very little about SROs and lodging houses. There are many of them. I'm sure there must be some in Melbourne. There are certainly many in other cities. We know very little about SROs, in particular life in SROs, and how people have lived and struggled and endured in SROs. So telling the unwritten history of the SRO seems to me in and of itself valuable. Secondly, I think there's an ethical imperative here. To break down Jack's door in the middle of the night in order to threaten his attempt to mobilize law must be condemned as an illegal act of coercive violence. But to characterize this act simply as lawless is to miss the vital work of legal relegation, in a sense outlawing Jack and creating the outlaw zone to which he was consigned. Tracing the work of law in creating outlaw space in both senses of the word outlaw, to me seems important political work. There's a third, perhaps wider significance, which gets us to property. To me, it's important to try and understand how property and property relations produces precarity. Now, all property is in one sense precarious. We can all lose our property. But more and more of us live under heightened precarious property relations. We need to understand this and the work that property does in producing and constituting precarity. Attending carefully to the manner in which we live on the land of others, as I put it here, is vital. Access to land is a prerequisite for human freedom on the simple principle that everything has to happen somewhere. Given that we all access land through and in relation to others, a recognition of property law's relational work in structuring the geographies in which we live, to me, is fundamental. Thank you very much. Now, what I'd like to do now is to stop talking and foreground some voices from the community. So I'm going to just stop sharing and I'm going to move to another screen, if I can. What you're going to hear are the voices of 3 community members. They're all members of the SRO Collaborative and the Right to Remain. They're peer researchers. On the left, you have Erica Grant. In the middle, you have Tom de Grey. And on the right, you have Richard Schwab. They're all SRO residents. And what I can't give you the full presentation here. You can find it online at righttoremain.ca. And they're using haiku. We use haiku as a research tool. I can talk about that at some other time. But what they're going to do is they're going to share from the haiku circle, as it's called, share haiku that have been collaboratively crafted by community members. So what I'm just going to sample this, and what they're going to do to begin with is they're going to tell us something about the context, the space of the downtown east side, which in part is a story of layers of dispossession, of course, indigenous dispossession, but also that of Japanese Canadians. Then we'll move on quickly to think about the SRO and the outlaw zone of the SRO, and then conclude with some haiku about resistance and community.
Faced the mountains once.
Men and axes came, stripped the land, and built a town. Vancouver became.
Labor for the mills. Issei built the street of dreams. Powell Street became.
Landscape dispossessed. Government took all they built. Left the buildings shells.
Oppenheimer Park, once the field of baseball dreams, shattered dreams and lives.
Eviction notice. Takes what little space I have. I'm not leaving here.
Shovel breaks down door. Landlord crashes in my space. I'm still here and strong.
Cast out in the night, living in a crowd of one, looking, reaching none.
History remembered again today. Legacy lives on.
Haiku in the park. Friendship circles thrive on hope. Fierce power are words.
Make Make our voices heard, joining acts of courage, hope, still the voices rise.
Our strength moves forward, calling out for justice now. We need rent control.
Tenants cooperate, no matter what weather, minds work together.
Many gave their lives so others could live their lives, remaining right here.
Taking care of self, taking care of each other, community care.
Optimism, love, resilient community.
The right to remain.
Thank you very much. I think that's an appropriate place to stop.
Nick, thank you so much for your fascinating presentation today. It's both disturbing, horrifying, but uplifting to see changes that are coming forth, and vulnerable citizens. Melbourne certainly shares the vulnerability of citizens across its various places of dwelling, including caravan parks, rooming houses, and single occupancy hotels. It's a salient call to action, in fact, to see how we can improve the lot of the most vulnerable in our society and to give them the right to live where they live, not as a nuisance. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
So I would like to thank you all for coming today to this final Dean's lecture for 2021. I also would like to encourage you to come to a symposium that we'll be holding early in November. The 2021 Housing Assembly, Creating Socially Valuable Housing. It's presented by ABP in collaboration with the Hallmark Research Initiative for Affordable Housing, and that's running between the 3rd and the 5th of November. So please do register now. And please visit the MSD website for details on our upcoming events and our YouTube channel to catch up on past talks. Thank you again, and I wish you all a good afternoon. Goodbye.